And hello, everyone. Welcome once again to another installment of our lecture series on the ancient Greeks. This lecture is going to deal with the period of the Persian Wars and the Classical Age. This is, for all intents and purposes, this is kind of the crucible of Greek civilization, the great conflict that, in so many ways, overshadowed the Classical Age. So much of classical literature is rooted in the stories and the victories of the Persian Wars. And a lot of the foreign policy that will develop over the course of the Classical Age and in the Hellenistic period and beyond will really be in uh, relationship to the Persian Empire. So let's dive right in. The Persian Wars themselves. When the Persians conquered Asia Minor in 546 BCE, emerging out of Central Asia, the plateaus and mountainous regions of Iran, expanding westward through Mesopotamia, down into the Middle East, to Levant, the Egypt, and then into Asia Minor. When they conquered Asia Minor, the Greek city-states that had developed during the Dark Ages and the early colonial period came under their control. This is Ionian Greece, the western portion of Asia Minor. In 499, some of those Greek city-states revolted against Persian rule and took the initiative and actually sacked and burned the capital of the local province at Sardis. This triggered Persian retribution, which was very swift for those Greek city-states initially. But because there were Greek city-states in mainland Greece that had supported the Ionian revolt, the Persians decided that it was time to deal with those mainland Greeks, particularly the Athenians. For the mainland Greeks, the issue becomes one of protecting Greek independence and the freedom and liberty of Greeks no matter where they are. So the conflict with Persia becomes rather ideological, and that ideology of protecting the freedom of all Greeks, no matter where they are, is something that a lot of varying interest groups will take up as their cause. We'll see that not only when the Greeks are unified against the Persians, but among the competing interests of the Greeks themselves, the Athenians versus the Spartans, for instance. In 490 BCE, the Persians, under their king Darius, send a military to attack the Greeks at the plains of Marathon. It was simply, the Greek fleet, or excuse me, the Persian fleet sailing across the Aegean Sea, landing near, not too far from Athens, landing a large mixed force, one of the most powerful militaries in the world. They had light infantry, they had bowmen, they had spearmen, they had cavalry. It really was the most technologically advanced and diverse army of the day. It was a multi-ethnic force. Unfortunately, they could not maneuver. The Greeks had sort of pinned them in, and they did not have the kind of heavy infantry that the Greeks had, that we talked about in an earlier lecture, the heavily armored hoplite. The hoplite was not good for long distance travel, but in close hand-to-hand fighting really couldn't be beaten. Cavalry certainly couldn't go up against the sort of um, the hoplite phalanx. It was sort of moved like a hedgehog. The spine of spears that stuck out from the shields. This was a real challenge for the Persians. They were forced to withdraw, and Darius would never again send a expeditionary force to Greece. This would fall to his son Xerxes, who decided a much different strategy to actually march down through across the Hellespont, that narrow waterway that leads into the Black Sea, march through there and systematically take out all the Greek city-states along the way and keep his army and his navy in close contact with one another. So the Persian navy would sail along the coast. The army would march along the coast to keep supplied via the navy and really take out all the Greek city-states all the way down as they started to approach Athens. It was long, it was slow, but it was designed to really overawe all the Greeks and not just target one. However, the eventual goal was to take out Athens and then move into the Peloponnese and take out Sparta. Massive force comes through. They make very rapid a rapid advance through northern Greece, through the kingdoms in the north. However, as they approached central and southern Greece, they are delayed at the mountain passes at Thermopylae, both by the Spartan navy, by the Spartan army on land guarding the pass, and the Athenian navy in the narrow straits around the islands just off the coast. This time allows the Athenians to prepare the bulk of their naval forces for where the real showdown happens, and that's the Battle of Salamis. It is a naval battle. The Athenians lure the Persians into this very narrow bay, the Bay of Salamis, and sort of surround the Persian navy and systematically set about destroying the Persian navy, which is largely borrowed, honestly, from the Phoenicians. So most of the Persian naval force is actually Phoenician in its origin. This now asserts Greek dominance of not only the Aegean, but will establish Greek dominance of the Mediterranean for much of the next 2 centuries. With their navy destroyed, the Persians are forced to withdraw about half of their land forces. They simply cannot be supplied without a large naval presence. The remaining Persian navy is defeated on land at the Battle of Plataea in 479 by a combined Greek military force under the leadership of the Spartans. It's at that point, 479, that we would say that the classical age really begins. Okay? That Greek independence is assured. Their military power and prowess has been proclaimed to the world by defeating one of the world's largest empires. And so now this great age of culture, of wealth, of prestige that historians look back to, that Western civilization looks back to and calls the classic period of Western civilization. The victors in this were Athens and Sparta. Athens, the great naval power; Sparta, the great land military power. Look a little bit of a comparison here. Athens controls the relatively small Attic Peninsula. Its citizens were largely free. However, slavery was known. Slavery in ancient Greece is quite different from the chattel slavery that we know in the American South centuries later. Slaves were treated a little bit better. Slaves tended to be a bit more educated. They were taken from among conquered peoples, so if the Athenians went to war against another Greek city-state, they might bring slaves back from there. It might be a Persian slave, something like that. After 508, Athens had a form of male suffrage democracy. There were a number of males who were allowed to vote, and a lot of major issues were put to the popular vote of the free male voting citizenry. It was not a representative democracy as we would understand it today, as in the Roman Republic, that the Roman Republic would establish at around the same time. It's a very different kind of popular democracy. As I mentioned a moment ago, they develop a strong navy that is both for military and commercial purposes, and they are actively engaged in regional diplomacy. One might say a little too engaged in regional diplomacy. Okay? They are very much outward-looking, very much about being an active participant in the diplomatic game of not only the Greek city-states, but also of the Eastern Mediterranean. Sparta, located in the Peloponnese, that large peninsula, almost an island, were it not for the Isthmus of Corinth. Sparta is surrounded by a mountainous region. It is a relatively closed society. Its agriculture is based on the widespread use of slaves, of slave labor. The local population, what are called the helots, were almost entirely enslaved, and so therefore the Spartan men could work on training exclusively in the military and not have to worry about tending the farm, so to speak. However, they did develop a mixed form of government. many people would say, well, Sparta was a monarchy. Sparta had oligarchs. Sparta was a closed society. But in reality, there was no one dominant form of government in Sparta. There were essentially, they had a series of checks and balances. They even had co-monarchs. So the Spartan form of government, in its mixture, allowing neither a dictatorship of a single individual or the dictatorship of the masses of the people, as you might have in a democracy, was avoided. And so Sparta really ends up becoming a model for government, not only taken up by the Romans, but eventually by, to some extent, the United States. They develop a powerful professional hoplite army. This is allowed, of course, because all men are free, essentially, to be in military service and not tied down by the burdens of agriculture. And their foreign policy is largely isolationist, meaning that they choose not to participate unless they have to, unless there's a specific Spartan interest at stake, and then they will go out there and defend the homeland. And so Sparta is very, very reluctant to engage in an active all-around diplomacy. As a result of this, much of the early classical age is dominated by Athens. They are the power par excellence. They form an alliance that's called the Delian League. It is designed to as as a trade zone. It's very economic, but it also has political and military dimensions. So, for instance, what Athens will do, Athens will serve as protector, so they want tribute from their allies. Then the Athenians will use that money to build up the Athenian navy. And if any of the allied states are in trouble, then the Athenian navy will simply show up. What this also does, however, is it allows the Athenians to more tightly police their own allies. And so we kind of say, is this really an alliance system, or is this a kind of Athenian empire? Because if those allies start to say, well, we want to be a little bit more independent of Athens, our ally Athens, the Athenians will send a couple of triremes, a couple of their warships, to that ally's coastline and say, hey, we hear you want to be a little bit more independent. That's not cool. So we say that this is an early form of gunboat diplomacy, that the Athenians will police their alliance system very much the way a later naval empire would, in simply sending around the warships when things start to get out of hand, and then the ally will back down. So what ends up happening is this alliance system is really to the benefit of Athens. Now, there's a shared benefit all around, but really economically, this truly benefits the Athenians. Their prosperity was heavily dependent upon their ability to export olive oil, which was sold, and they purchased grain in return. There would be no way to support the population of Athens based on the land in the Attic Peninsula under wheat cultivation. Could not have happened. The funds that are raised through olive oil production could absolutely do that and provide a profit. What this required, though, was that the Athenians keep open those lines of transportation to engage in commerce, which made the strong naval presence even more important. This also refers back to why the Athenians built the long walls between their port and the city of Athens itself. It was vital that the link not only to the sea was maintained, but also that their commerce would be protected by a powerful naval presence. Freeborn males were allowed to participate in the democracy. We mentioned that a moment ago. However, women and slaves were excluded from that. The most dramatic, shall we say, manifestation of the golden age of Athens was the massive construction projects on the Acropolis. The Persian Wars leveled the city of Athens. The Athenians actually abandoned the city with the onset of the second Persian invasion under Xerxes, and took to their ships at Salamis. And so much of the first Acropolis, with its smaller temple of Athena, were destroyed. This was then built after it during the age of Pericles, and it is a monument to Greek style. It is actually done in a somewhat archaic style. The exterior of the Parthenon, the columns around the outside, are done in the Doric style. However, as you approach the interior, it's done in the more international or pan-Hellenic Ionic style. Okay, this is an icon of Western civilization. But Greeks were also known not only for their temple construction, but also for their carving. And by the classical age, we see here, both of these are from the Acropolis. This is from the Parthenon. This is from that that center frieze that would have been in this area here. This carving would have been attached there. These are the so-called Elgin marbles, would have been in that area, and you can see how they're angled so as to fit the slant of the roof line there. This is another carving of Athena from the temple of Athena Nike, the temple of Athena Victory. And we can see here, especially in both of these, the way in which these very skilled artists now are carving not only the human form, but also the drapery of the garments around the body, and how sort of this watery, shimmering effect, this tremendous realism that's shown here. These are hallmarks of classical art and would echo down through the ages. Social relations within during the classical age among Greek city-states varied from city-state to city-state, but on the whole we can say that there was great gender inequality within marriage. It was a patriarchal society. There was actually fairly little contact between husbands and wives. The goal of marriages were the production it was a dynastic union for the production of children. Middle-class males did have the right to vote. The democracy tended, however, to be dominated largely by the military and economic elites. Women were largely confined to the home. They did not have, much outlet in the broader society. And this will contrast pretty significantly to what we'll see in Roman society. Other aspects of this that's often addressed both in philosophy and in theater. There were relationships between men of a sexual nature. Sometimes males practiced what was called maturation or life cycle homosexuality, so that there would be relations between individuals of the same sex, but that was as a stage of development, of both physical and emotional development. And so the idea was that even though those types of relationships would be acceptable for younger individuals, and sometimes there would be a sense of a somewhat older male engaged in a relationship with a somewhat younger male as a kind of teacher-pupil relationship, or might be done in the context of warfare, an older male training a younger male. There would be other physical aspects of that relationship. As time went on, as you got older, you exchanged those relationships for those with women, and you went on to produce family and have children and so forth and so on. Now we'll transition into what really brings about the end of the the golden age of Athens ends with the Peloponnesian War. This is the great triumph of Athens, and it's extending its empire, and its sort of heavy-handedness in controlling its allies leads to a great deal of resentment. Many people start to see what Athens is doing as a kind of imperialism. So there is an anti-Athenian coalition led by Sparta. And Sparta really leads this in defense of quote-unquote Greek liberty. So the same issue that led all Greeks to unite against the Persians now is what's driving many Greeks to ally with Sparta against this Athenian heavy-handedness. The Peloponnesian League is the group that the Spartans organized to oppose the Delian League of Athens. Now, the Athenians have a really good war strategy, which is don't confront the Spartan military on land. You're going to lose if you do that. You wait it out. You rely on grain shipments. You use the treasury. You use the navy. You protect yourself behind the great walls. The Spartans will not be able to touch you. It does mean that the land in Attica will be devastated, and that will be a problem in the long run, but eventually you can take down the Spartans, right? You can just basically wait it out. The problem for Athens is that every time that there was a Spartan attack and all those farmers came in from the outlying areas into the city of Athens, Athens got very crowded, lots of disease broke out, and there was a great plague that broke out 3 years into the war. And this dealt a tremendous demographic blow to the Athenian population. And one of the most important people was the aging elder of the city, Pericles, dies in the plague. His strategy was then abandoned by others, most notably a very cunning, very able politician named Alcibiades, who decided to divert the major attention of the war away from Sparta and towards one of Sparta's allies in Sicily, Syracuse. Incidentally, the Syracusan expedition was also to get at agricultural land in Syracuse as well, wheat production on Sicily. The plan fails horribly. The Athenians lose the bulk of their army, great cost to their navy, and it's a military disaster. Alcibiades eventually forced out. Socrates was implicated actually in this, the folks who had supported Alcibiades as well. And Socrates will eventually, because of his connection there, will be condemned to death. Eventually, the Athens starts to recover a little bit from this, but then the Spartans call in not only the Corinthians, who have a navy that is as powerful as the Athenian, but also the Spartans call in the big enemy, Persia. And this allows the Spartan coalition, now with the assistance of Persia, to defeat the Athenians once and for all. One can consider this the ultimate betrayal of the Greek cause, that in order to quote-unquote defend Greek liberty, you should call in the greatest enemy of Greek liberty. Spartan post-war leadership is generally considered to be a disaster. They merely exchanged Athenian heavy-handedness with Spartan heavy-handedness, and this leads to a breakdown of any cooperation, once again, between Greeks. Several city-states exchange leadership roles over time. Thebes actually will put together a military system that will be able to go after the Spartans. The Thebans will invade Sparta. They will be one of the first Greek city-states to ever defeat Sparta militarily. And Sparta will, by the end of the Classical Age, become an unimportant backwater. Instead, the power that will unite all Greeks and lead it into a glorious future, at least in the short term, will be the kingdom of Macedon in the north. Not a city-state, a territorial kingdom. Many regarded the Macedonians as not even being very Greek. They spoke a Greek dialect. They were not seen as being quite civilized, but under their king, Philip II, and his incredible military force that he builds up, and the innovations that he adds to hoplite warfare, he is able to unite the Greek city-states by treaty, and is then able to promise that he will go after the Persians. Unfortunately, Philip is assassinated in 336 BCE, and so the war against Persia would eventually be led by his son Alexander. Success of that war will, of course, earn him the title that is known in posterity as Alexander the Great. We'll leave that for another lecture. For now, Thank you very much for listening.